I'm Beth, and we're doing an interview that's celebrating our wildlife conservation heritage with Dr. Robert Seabloom. Behind our camera, we have Emily Hutchins from Minnesota Wildlife Society, and I think we'll just dig right in here. What is your birthplace and date?
Well, I was born in 1932 in St. Paul, Minnesota. Grew up in Ramsey County, just north of St. Paul, which was bush country at that time. Now it's all suburbia.
Okay. What were your parents' names?
My parents were, well, my dad went by Hilmer Seabloom, it's Swedish, and Ragnar Hilmer Seabloom is my grandfather, emigrated from Sweden. My mother was, her name was Gladys. Her surname was Zischi, which has Germanic origins, I am told. And she grew up in St. Paul. And my father grew up in Iowa and then moved to Minnesota as a young man.
Okay. Where did you grow up?
Well, as I mentioned, I grew up in rural Ramsey County on a corner of my grandfather's 80-acre farm, which was just out in the sand plain north of St. Paul. Why he decided to farm there, I don't know, because it was terrible farmland. But I was there for all my younger years and stayed with my parents, actually through college.
It was crop farming or animal?
Yeah, it was diversified farming, dairy, diversified. They were very poor farms at the time, but not very productive, but that's where these Swedes settled. They're better than rocks in Sweden. And it's interesting because now it's very pricey. High-end suburban homes in there these days.
Okay. What university did you attend, and when did you attend?
I attended the University of Minnesota. I entered in 1949. In high school, I was pretty good in biology, and therefore, if you were good in biology at the time, the word was, oh, you've got to be a doctor. So I started out, told what to do, and I started out as a pre-med, and I decided I didn't like being a pre-med very much. And so I switched my major to zoology. At the time, I knew nothing about wildlife programs at that time in the late 40s and early 50s. So I got my bachelor's degree was in zoology at the U of M. Then after a 2-year stint in the Army, I returned and I knew I had to go to graduate school because there's nothing you can do with a bachelor's degree in zoology. And I started shopping around and looking at various programs. I just happened to discover that the U of M had a wildlife management program on the St. Paul campus. So I inquired about that and was accepted.
So that's where you got your master's degree?
Yeah.
Did you get your PhD there too?
Yes, I did.
Okay.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And how did you decide to pursue a career in wildlife management or conservation?
Well, as I mentioned, I didn't know that the field really existed per se until I started looking around and talking to people and talking to faculty. And it suddenly dawned on me, hey, this sounds like fun. And so I enrolled in it and started taking mammalogy and beginning wildlife management courses and things like that, and on both campuses. And it just kind of grew from there. So, and I decided this would be a very good field. I initially thought about probably working for a conservation department or a game and fish department, but it ended up in academia.
Okay. What hobbies or books or events influenced your career choice? And did you hunt or fish?
As a kid, I was in Scouts, and we did a lot of camping and things like that, and canoeing, outdoor activities. That probably set the stage to some extent. I read a number of outdoor books and articles, and at that time I was not a hunter. In Ramsey County is a wildlife refuge, and so there's no hunting and no shooting in Ramsey County. I don't think there still is any, and it's too heavily populated, and so I did not have a hunting tradition in the family. We fished quite a bit. We grew up on the lake, but I did not hunt until after I got out of college and in grad school and discovered hunting. And then I got into it, hunting to some extent, but it was an acquired thing, not an inherited thing.
Okay. I have to ask you a quick question about Scouts since you mentioned it.
Sure.
Okay, I have to ask you that question about Scouts. In this day and age, they have worked in wildlife conservation, a little bit of forestry, and some of those topics into current scouting. What did they do then when you were in scouting?
They did not have a wildlife management merit badge the way they do today. They did have a bird study merit badge, and I don't recall if there was a nature study. I remember I got a bird study merit badge because I had to learn 21 species.
Oh.
But and then they had all the other outdoor activities, but I think bird study was about it as far as wildlife was concerned, as I recall.
Okay. Who were some of your mentors and how did they influence you?
Okay, mentors at the U of M. I worked under, my advisor was Jim Beer, and he was a mammalogist at the University of Minnesota. And interestingly enough, he was a student of Aldo Leopold up until the time of Leopold's death. So in a way, Aldo Leopold could be sort of an academic grandfather of mine, but he didn't, but he, as you know, Leopold died fighting a fire in the middle of his career, and so my advisor had to get another advisor, and I don't know who that was, but Jim Beer was my advisor. Bill Marshall, William H. Marshall, I revere. He provided a lot of mentoring and a lot of financial support when I was in graduate school. So I am very grateful to him. There were people in other departments, such as Frank Irving over in forestry, who was one of the pioneers in proponents of prescribed burning, and that's where I first got the itch about prescribed burning. The Don Lawrence over in botany was a plant ecologist, and he was just a wonderful person and took us on field trips all over Minnesota, and I remember him a lot. Dwayne Warner, he was in zoology, but in the Bell Museum of Natural History, I took ornithology from him. Joe Hickey, an ornithologist from Wisconsin, who taught me field ornithology at the Itasca Biological Station. And Hickey had a pair of ears that you wouldn't believe in terms of knowing bird songs. These are some of the ones that really influenced me as a graduate student.
Do you feel like you're as much a birder as you are a mammologist?
I am primarily a mammalogist,
okay.
But I enjoy birding a lot, and I've got a few papers and small papers on birds and trail censuses and things like that. So birding has been more of a little bit of a hobby with me, and I enjoy birding, but professionally I'm a mammalogist.
Okay. What aspect of your formal education was the most useful in your career?
That is interesting. I think some of the diversity of offerings at the U of M, the program at the University of Minnesota was not an applied program. Some wildlife schools seem to turn out more technicians than people who have broad principle-based offerings, and the U of M was in the latter category. And I think having a broad background in botany and zoology and in forestry, a variety of different departments rather than strictly a small packet of straight wildlife courses. I think that helps a lot. I think that's important to wildlife people. They can always learn techniques. There are a lot of techniques on the job. They need a good background to start with.
Good advice. Do you want me to ask you about your military service?
You can. It was only 2 years. I went through ROTC, and,
okay.
and I did not go overseas, so it was The military service helped me get me through grad school through the GI Bill. Other than
Okay.
that,
Well, let me ask you this. Did
Okay.
your military service relate in any way to your wildlife professional career?
no, it
Okay.
did not.
All right. Okay. How about, let's see, I'll have you tell us about your family.
Okay. Met my wife over at the Itasca Biological Station in Minnesota, and it was an interesting thing. Itasca, if you've ever been there, and a lot of people have, is kind of a magical place, and it was long dear to my heart. And we met there. She was a graduate student, and I was a professor there, and things clicked. And about a year later, we were married. We have two grown sons. One is, they went diverse paths. Our older son is a musician. He teaches orchestra here in Grand Forks and plays in the Fargo Symphony. He's a low strings player. And our younger son followed a path a little bit closer to mine, in that he went into ecology, and he is into restoration ecology and works in Colorado currently for the Boulder Open Space Program as a trails manager. So he does trail design and restoration work in the Front Range of the Rocky Mountains. He's become a mountain man.
How did your career affect your family, do you think?
Well, that's an interesting question. The family had to get used to having dead animals in the refrigerator, in the freezing compartment, and so my wife, and of course she was a biologist too, so she didn't affect her that much, but they got used to having dead birds showing up in Ziploc bags in our freezer. The boys, I made sure that they took in scouting nature and wildlife management merit badges, and they still have a strong interest in that, even though they didn't follow exactly the same paths. So, and we've always been outdoors people. We did a lot of camping and been on canoe trips and been up in the Boundary Waters and places like that. One time I took my younger son into the Pecos Wilderness in New Mexico, 12,000 feet, where I had a graduate student working on bighorn sheep. And I think that was kind of a turning point for him in his life in terms of loving the mountains.
Okay, let's see. How did you get your first job?
My first job, I suppose, was a temporary job with the North Dakota Game and Fish Department, because as a graduate master's student, I was looking for a research project, and Jim Beer came along and said, how would you like to work on muskrats in North Dakota? And I thought, that's good. It was basically basic population study and movements in home range and population dynamics of muskrats. And the North Dakota Game and Fish Department wanted some basic data on muskrats, and they were willing to support me, and so I got a job as a fur biologist, temporary, for 2 years, studying muskrats in North Dakota. Then I went back to school, of course, and then after that, job opportunity came up north in UND, and a couple other possibilities, but that was about the history.
So looking back and considering how things are now, what were your pay and benefits like, and were there promotional opportunities here at UND?
Well, there are promotional opportunities. UND has a dubious reputation of being the second lowest paying university in the United States. I think it ranked 49th. I don't know what its ranking is right now, but it was enough to get by on. And if you came as a new faculty member to the University of North Dakota, you did not come for the remuneration.
Oh, okay.
You came for there are benefits, and you came for the environment. And coming to a state like North Dakota, it's great if you don't like crowds, and you like open space, and has a lot of other amenities.
All right. Briefly describe the wildlife profession of the day and the changes that you've observed over time.
Okay, that's an interesting question because when I first started out, as lots of people who've been around for a while realize, at that time, the wildlife profession, if you asked, why are you going to wildlife? Oh, I like to hunt and fish. And we encountered that here too, and then we socked our students with calculus and biochemistry. They came to a grim reality of that it's more than hunting and fishing. But basically, at the time that I was in the program back in Minnesota, it was the wildlife field was hunting and fishing. Now you look at all of the things that have gone on since that time, of the environmental movements of the 60s, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Wilderness Act, National Environmental Policy Act, environmental impact statements. Affirmative action was fantastic because all suddenly the profession, I don't mean to be racist, but when I entered it was a bunch of white guys. And now all of a sudden women were entering the profession and it was becoming much more ethnically diverse. Endangered Species Act, the non-game programs came in. And so today it is a much more diverse and interesting profession to me than this single-minded thing that when I joined. Although, of course, the Pittman-Robertson Act and the Dingell-Johnson Act and fisheries still pay most of the bills. But it is, the profession has become so much more diverse, and that's for the good. It really, I think it was really very, very healthy to see that kind of development.
Let's see, what would be your best professional advice for a young conservationist today?
Well, be good. Be a good, you need a good solid background in wildlife, but in a lot of other fields too. So in terms of your, don't get specialized too quickly. Get a good broad-based education to start with. Be a good communicator. That's one of the problems that a lot of wildlife people have. I think they're so used to the outdoors and relating to the general public, and probably it's been said that if we could just convince the general public of what we know right now, we would be way ahead of ourselves. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. So be a good communicator. Be stubborn, because it's not an easy profession to break into. If a job comes up, take it and get your foot in the door. And even if it's a low-level job, take it. And then once you get your foot in the door and you can grow from there, and as all the openings crop up, you can go after them, and you'll have a little bit of priority. Be dedicated and have a lot of courage. Because if you're going to be a manager, you're going to be confronting a lot of issues. And I've known people who've literally been willing to lay their jobs on the line on the basis of principle. And I think that's extremely important. I know people who have been reprimanded and transferred, but they on a matter of principle. And I think more power to them. But they had to pay a price, but they had the courage and dedication to stand up for a principle.
That's some very interesting advice. I think on that note, I'm going to ask you, how do you think wildlife research has progressed since you were a grad student?
Okay, when I was a grad student, when we were catching animals, I'll use mammals as an example because that's my field. We put out a bunch of traps, and we'd catch them in mice, and we'd either ear tag them or toe clip them and let them go and hope we'd catch them again. I had a real opportunity as a graduate student because at the time, Bill Marshall, who I mentioned earlier, received a grant to develop radio telemetry techniques in tracking animals. And I think that was the first radio telemetry study ever. And it was published in the Journal of Wildlife Management, Movements of Porcupines. Actually, we started out, Marshall was an upland game guy, and he wanted to study ruffed grouse. But the transmitters that were developed at the time were so heavy, and we didn't know much about ruffed grouse, and we put these transmitters, which weighed about 50 grams, on the back of a ruffed grouse, and they promptly committed suicide flying into trees and things like that. And so this other graduate student and I, at the time, we were working up near COWCH, Minnesota, and we said, what are we going to do? And Marshall was in New Zealand at the time, and so we decided on our own, we got to find an animal to put these things on. And what could carry a 55-gram transmitter? Well, porcupines can. And so we got some forestry students to help catch some live porcupines, and we put these transmitters on porcupines. So what started out as a project intending to track ruffed grouse, we ended up radio tracking porcupines. But that was exciting because I think that was the first study that was ever published using radio telemetry techniques. So in terms of technology, I guess that would be the big one as far as I was concerned in the field. And of course, it's mushroomed since then. Radio telemetry has mushroomed, and we're now into GPS systems and a lot of remote sensing and that sort of thing, which has really, really blossomed.
Let's see, what is the most interesting project you were involved in?
The most interesting project, being the only mammalogist around here, academically, I worked on a wide variety of species, from small mammals up to elk. I think our bighorn sheep project out in the Badlands was a fascinating one. It was focusing on basic ecology of bighorns in the Badlands. The population had been declining. There was a lot of oil development, and the Game and Fish Department was concerned about disturbance and sensitive areas, lambing grounds, things like that. And I had two graduate students who worked on sheep. That was one of my final projects, and that was a fascinating study, and we came up with some recommendations on mitigating the road development and traffic patterns around lambing grounds. And that was a fascinating one. And shortly before I retired, on the small mammal side, hantavirus reared its ugly head in North Dakota, and I suddenly found myself thrust into the wildlife disease area, and so we did a hantavirus survey throughout the state, looking at incidents of infection in small mammals. And so we sampled a wide variety of species and areas throughout North Dakota, and gave the health department some insights on incidents of seropositive deer mice in North Dakota over a couple of years.
What was the most pressing issue that you had to deal with, and then how was that issue resolved?
The most pressing issue in terms of conservation, probably I'm thinking maybe the bighorn sheep thing, because there were so many other interests involved. The project was sponsored through the Game and Fish Department, but the oil industry was providing most of the funding, and so we were doing a balancing act between various interests, the Game and Fish Department, the Bureau of Land Management, the several different oil companies, and it got to be rather dicey at times. And the oil companies didn't understand that they set up deadlines which we weren't couldn't meet, because any anyone who understands academia knows that graduate students and thesis writing can't be locked into a precise time scale. And so we had to tell them that, and they weren't happy about it, but it was a dicey thing. We had a very difficult meeting in Billings one day, talking to the oil companies, and that was troubling, but we survived it, and we tried to explain to them, you're going to get your thesis. It's out of your control, because faculty advisory committees are faculty advisory committees, and they accept drafts, and then they send them back for a revision and things like that. And we had to educate these guys. I don't know if they really sunk in with them, but they finally got their dissertations, and it was over with, so it was resolved.
What do you think was the most difficult thing you had to overcome in your career?
Let's see. I had to be diverse. It was difficult getting the program going here. I was the 5th member of the faculty, and all of a sudden I was saddled with, suggested by the administration that we develop a wildlife program here. So in addition to having a heavy teaching load and having some graduate students, I was saddled with writing a curriculum and having to consult with all the interest groups and agencies and jumping through the university hoops and requirements and getting some exceptions made, that sort of thing, was a real challenge very early in the career. Ended up being very successful, and I'm proud of the way the program has blossomed since that time. But that was a heady time, and it was pretty difficult. I'm trying to think of other difficulties. Funding varies from project to project, and getting support for students as they come in. I've had some students who had to do their theses on next to no funding. I had a student who worked out in the Badlands on cottontails. He spent the year that summer living in the backseat of his car, and others were fairly well funded, but it was always a challenge getting support for graduate students. Other difficulties are dealing with colleagues, faculty meetings.
Well, on that note, I'll ask you, what was the high point of your career, and then what was the low point of your career?
I would have a problem with the low point, because there are bumps, and high points included. I was shocked when I received the North Dakota Award, Professional Award from the North Dakota chapter of the Wildlife Society. I was just literally in tears, and for a variety of reasons, I had no idea. I was on the council at the time, and I thought we had made that decision, and they snuck that in on me, and it really surprised, and it was pleasant, more than pleasantly surprised, but it was the first time they had given the professional award to an educator, so that was a matter of pride. Publication of my book was, of course, that was after I was off the faculty, but that was certainly a high point. I still think of myself as having a career, even though I'm not being paid for it.
Did you want to show the book? Sure.
And this is the book, Mammals of North Dakota. It was a 9-year project, and it started out with Northern Prairie Wildlife Research Center in Jamestown asking me to develop a series of species accounts for the mammals of the state, so they could use for environmental planning and going into impact statements and the like. And I did that, and then this is during retirement, and then after I did that, they suggested, well, why don't you develop it into a book? And so I was able to find a willing publisher, the North Dakota Institute for Regional Studies, And I added quite a bit to it, some of it out of my courses and some of the species accounts. And some help from the Game and Fish Department. Bill Jensen wrote a habitat chapter, and one unique thing was the getting John Hoganson, the state paleontologist, to write a chapter on the fossil mammals of the state in addition to the living mammals. They've included all the Native American names I could find for all the species, for the mammals of the state, and I think that was a real plus. And that was a project started way back by Vernon Bailey in his old biological survey of North Dakota that came out in 1926. And so we built on that. I got some help from Sitting Bull College down in Fort Yates. Some of the students up there updated the list of Native American names. So this is kind of a matter of some pride.
Oh, yeah. It's an accomplishment.
Thank you.
I think on that note, I will ask you, why do you continue as a Professor Emeritus at UND?
That's an interesting question. To me, being a faculty member is as much, is more than a job. It's something of a lifestyle. It gets in your blood. I have a strong interest in wildlife. I think I still have some contributions to make. I love students, and I like to visit with them, and I like to help out my department and help out students whenever I can, or other colleagues. So I've done a little bit of part-time teaching over at the University of Minnesota, Crookston, and I currently teach some classes for the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute on campus here, which is a program for older than average, older students. They're not registered students. They're it's sort of an adult education program for older people. And so I've taught a class on nature on the Northern Plains, and I'm currently teaching a little class on 4 great conservationists who you may or may not have heard of as far as a general public, and I'm having a lot of fun with that one. And, so I enjoy teaching, I enjoy students, I enjoy mammalogy and my colleagues in the wildlife field.
What do you think the role of universities should be in terms of helping wildlife?
That's a very important one, and I'm really grateful that when I first joined the faculty in the 60s, and I had no idea at the time, and I did not intend to start, there was no wildlife program here, and we just happened to have a dean of arts and sciences who loved wildlife. He loved ducks, and he approached us and said, I think you should have a wildlife program. So I think that was really important, because at the time there was no wildlife program in the state of North Dakota. And so the university filled that niche of providing a pool of people to enter into the wildlife field, and I think we've done that rather well. We've literally populated the State Game and Fish Department. We've had a number of directors, and I don't know how many division chiefs and chief biologists in the State Game and Fish Department. We've sent people over into Minnesota, Minnesota DNR. We've sent people into Montana and other states. So I think the university had played a very important role in the wildlife field. The university provides, again, a diversity of education beyond straight wildlife courses, which I think is extremely important. The university is a forum for issues which agencies may not be able to provide because of their missions and sometimes politics. And so in a university setting, we can explore issues and on an open basis without fear of retribution from politics and legislatures and things like that. So I think that's really important. I remember the first Earth Day in 1970, and Students for Environmental Defense. That was the core group, and the university provided the setting for that. We brought in a lot of speakers, and it was very important. We had a film festival and all kinds of things that went on. It was just wonderful. And if didn't have a university setting, they would not have been able to have that sort of a forum going on. We explored a variety of environmental issues, including wildlife.
What was your most dangerous or frightening experience?
Oh, one where I was really scared to death. I was in Mexico, and I went to the American Society of Mammalogists, met in Mexico City, and afterwards I went on a collecting trip with some Mexicans into southern Mexico, and I recall being lost in a Mexican bat cave for something like 4 hours, and our flashlights were beginning to get very dim. And I thought, here I am. And what a relief to get out of that one. Bat caves are terrible places to explore anyway, because they're something like Dante's conception of hell. You're crawling through bat guano, and there's this fine rain of bat urine falling on from the ceilings. It was interesting experience, but one I never wanted to go through again, ever. So that was probably by far the worst one.
Okay. How about what was your most humorous experience?
I was telling a little story to some people the other day about we were out in the Badlands, and we had there's another student out there. It wasn't one of my students, but he was a student of a parasitologist here in the department, and he was supposed to be working on skunk parasites. And this guy, he was a nice guy, but he really should have been an English major. And he was totally inept in the field. He'd never been in the field before, and had a lot of trouble catching anything, much less skunks. But he finally caught one, and he did a post-mortem on it, took some parasites out. And living out in the Badlands, we were in the little town of Amadon, which now has about 20 people. Little game and fish trailer, little outhouse out back. So the amenities were very primitive, and the outhouse is one of the amenities. And this student made the mistake of disposing of his skunk carcass down through the outhouse hole. And he was almost killed in the process subsequently. And they made him fish that skunk carcass out of the outhouse hole with a old piece of barbed wire. He managed to twist it around. And I look back on that, that was one of the little funnier things. It wasn't funny for the kid, and I felt sorry for him, and I don't know whatever became of him, but I don't think he ever became a parasitologist. But that was probably one of the funnier ones.
Okay. You've kind of already described some of this, but what would you consider to be your 3 most significant contributions to the field?
The students, I think, yeah. In fact, when I look back at some of the students and where they've gone, students who have had either my advisees or courses with me. I've had 2 presidents of the Wildlife Society. I don't know how many prominent game and fish people. 1 director of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. 1 national park superintendent, and a lot of others that have done very, very well. So I would say the students would be probably at the top of the list. I've been involved in a number of issues, and I take some pride in that. And as far as research contributions, they've been diverse. I've had to work on a variety of things, and so in terms of taking one species and making it grow into, that hasn't happened because they've had to work with such a variety of species. But I think, that would be about it, I think. The ones that stand out in my mind.
Okay. I'm going to switch tracks just a little bit here. I have talked to several of the faculty here, just to get a little bit of background on you, because I haven't known you that long myself. And people have commented about specifically your dedication to conservation and educating people on wildlife. But somebody told me that you have served at the Red Cross all of your life, and the reason is your philosophy is to help all wildlife, including the two-legged ones. So, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, not all my life.
Okay.
We had a monstrous flood in 1997 that came close to wiping out Grand Forks, East Grand Forks. And my wife and I were in the middle of that, and we were sandbagging at the time. But I had just retired from the faculty, and so after that flood, we got to thinking about, well, how are we going to spend our time? And we decided that, having had a brief exposure of being recipients of some of the benefits of the Red Cross in terms of feeding and assistance when we evacuated, we barely the clothes on our backs, and they provided us with some clothes and some food and things like that. And thought, well, that might be a good retirement activity and perhaps a little bit of payback for some of the things that we got. And so we became active as local volunteers and in the Red Cross Disaster Services. And so we've been active in that ever since, and not just with local disasters, including floods and tornadoes and fires that go on around here, but been out on a number of national disasters, been on several hurricanes and tornadoes elsewhere, and it's been an exciting and very rewarding experience. I remember the first hurricane we went on, it was Hurricane George in 1998. We hadn't been disaster team members for less than a year, and they said, how would you like to go on Hurricane George? And so, okay, and off we went. And when you volunteer for a national event, you have to go out for about 3 weeks or so. And so we flew into Atlanta and got immediately sent off to Puerto Rico for 3 weeks. And we were told that before we left, don't go to Puerto Rico because you'll probably get some tropical disease and that sort of thing. And so we ended up in Puerto Rico anyway, and it was exciting. You're dealing with no power, no water, or water trucks coming in and things like that. Sometimes you're lucky enough to stay in a hotel, and sometimes you're sleeping on the floor or on a campus cot or on a church pew or something like that. And on these national events, you never know quite what to expect. But so that's been a very rewarding experience, and I've continued to work with the Red Cross ever since. It's probably in addition to wildlife, my principal extracurricular activity.
That's a good one. Okay, who are 3 people you believe are the most influential in developing the field of wildlife management?
Well, that's a difficult one because I can think of lots. I mentioned earlier the 4 conservationists that I mentioned earlier, specifically wildlifers. Of course, Aldo Leopold has to be on the list. In terms of personal importance to me in wildlife management, Paul Arrington, who was internationally known for his work on muskrats and theory of predation and intercompensatory factors, he would rank very high. Olis Muri would rank very high at the Elk of North America, field guide animal tracks. Closer to home, I have to rate Bill Marshall, all the people that he produced at the University of Minnesota in running the Itasca Biological Station. Durward Allen, I don't know if you've heard of Durward Allen or not. professor at Purdue, and he wrote a book in the mid-50s, Our Wildlife Legacy, and it's one of the most wonderful reads that you can imagine, and it ranks with, it's more of a, it's not exactly a textbook, but they used it as a textbook in wildlife management at Minnesota at the time that I took it, and it was just a wonderful read, and he had a major impact, I think. There was, at the time I took wildlife management, there was Leopold's game management in the early 1930s, and really not much else until this Derwent Allen's book came out. And I would recommend it to anyone. And so those are some of the ones.
Okay. What do you think makes a great wildlife manager? And specifically name 3 skills that a good wildlife professional should have.
Okay, breadth of knowledge,
Okay.
important. That goes beyond wildlife. Communication skills are extremely important. I'd lump then, if you want 3, I'd have lump courage and dedication together.
Okay. Why should someone become a wildlife professional today?
Challenge, challenging. If you're up for a challenge and you're interested in science, biological sciences, and you're up for challenges, you look at all of the things going on today in terms of threats to wildlife and other components of environment, climate change, human population pressures. I think about what's been going on in Colorado recently. Human population pressures and people living where they don't belong, and then they pay a heavy price afterwards. Environmental planning, trying to mitigate that sort of thing. If you're up for it, and you've got some dedication to work in it, it'll be a very up to the challenge. Be a very, very rewarding field, and it's going to get even more challenging in the future with human population growth.
Okay. How did you get involved with the Wildlife Society?
I was a grad student, and again, Bill Marshall encouraged all of us to become members of the Wildlife Society, that you need to become members of a professional society, and this is the primary one. And so I joined the Wildlife Society and the American Society of Mammalogists, and I'm probably one of the few remaining life members of the Wildlife Society, because they don't have life memberships anymore. They did at the time, and I think they were strapped for cash, and so they wanted the $100. And so I thought, as a grad student, hey, that's a good deal. And then, so a number of us became life members, and then not too many years later, then they canceled the life memberships. So I'm probably one of the few remaining life members of the Wildlife Society.
Okay. Let's see, how did your membership in the Wildlife Society help your career?
Oh, it was fantastic. I confess I have not been to many national meetings. I've been to the North American Wildlife Conference a number of times, and the national meetings of the Wildlife Society. I've been more active at the state level, and I think the North Dakota chapter is one of the premier chapters of the Wildlife Society in the country, and it's dealt very actively in a variety of issues, especially water-based issues, agricultural drainage, energy development, these sorts of things. And so I've learned a lot, and I've learned to respect a lot of the people who are confronting these issues on a day-by-day basis. Extremely valuable contact. It's inspiring to see. And so I've been to just about every meeting of the North Dakota chapter that I've been able to attend.
Okay. What are your your thoughts on the future of this profession?
It's got nowhere to go but up. I mean, it's doing well now, and as I mentioned earlier, it's become much more diverse and it's grown. The future is going to, there's a lot of future challenges, as I mentioned, with population pressures. I think the opportunities are probably going to increase because of the increased challenges. And the future wildlifers are going to be dealing more and more with human population pressures, I think. Other kinds of issues, urban wildlife issues, because of people moving into habitat that maybe they shouldn't be, but they're going to be confronting urban wildlife issues, wildlife disease issues, because there's going to be more and more contact between people and wildlife, even not in terms of necessarily consumptive contact, but just contact. And so there's going to be, you know, ancillary issues dealing with wildlife, and it's not going to go away. And so there's going to be a lot of things going on in the future.
Is there anything else you'd like to tell others about your career? That's a loaded question.
Yeah, it's a loaded question. There's probably a lot of things I know that are probably best left unsaid. But I'm trying to think about my career. It's been it's been a rewarding one, and with retirement, I have more freedom to do things that I might not have been free to do as a faculty member, because not because the university held me back. You know, we're certainly not censored. We have academic freedom and that sort of thing, but because I have time, and so I'm going to continue to be active as long as I'm able, and I'd love to continue to have some kind of contact with students and with my colleagues in the profession.
Well, that's all the questions that I have for you.
Okay.
I want to thank you for coming and spending some time with us. And
Well, thank you for the visit.
yeah.